I work for InfraCredit. I'm a development finance expert by background. Worked in domestic capital markets, corporate finance, helping local corporates and sub-sovereigns and subnational governments to raise corporate domestic debt, largely in Nigeria. I've also worked on some international advisory work in my past. And the InfraCredit, I got involved from inception, working with the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority alongside the Private Infrastructure Development Group, who were the initial sponsors that developed the concept of establishing a local specialized guarantee institution that could help to mobilize long-term local currency domestic credit from institutional investors like pensions, insurance, to invest in infrastructure, help thereby enabling more productive allocation of capital that can create jobs and support local economic growth. And InfraCredit was established to do this by building local capacity, issuing local currency guarantees, and crowding in long-term finance with institutional investors. And this capital is largely invested in government securities. But now what we're doing is helping companies that are building power projects, that are helping to construct digital infrastructure projects, special economic zones, and transport and distribution logistics businesses to help to borrow in the currency in which their revenues are being generated. One of the challenges we face in Africa is the currency risk as a result of devaluation and a mismatch between your earnings and your liability. What InfraCredit was established to do was to help to restructure where necessary, but also help to enable companies match their funding with their liability. So to date, largely in Nigeria where we've operated, we've helped the local pension funds to actually expand the asset class of investments they put their capital to by increasing that to investing in corporate credit for infrastructure. We've helped to lengthen the tenor for which these companies can borrow, because infrastructure is a long-term asset. And we've helped to stretch this tenor with our guarantees from previously 5 to 7 years to up to 20 years. So we have companies raising 20-year financing in local currency, largely provided by domestic pension funds. The credit markets in Africa, though developing, is largely fragmented and still underdeveloped compared to other countries. Based on a recent report by the International Capital Market Association, in the US, the corporate bond market is sized about $10.9 trillion. In China, I think is about $7.4 trillion. While Africa is roughly around, I think, 148 or thereabout $1 billion. So you could see that there's a significant amount of room, and this is really situated within a few African countries: South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and I think Mauritius as well. So, but we need inclusive growth, and you see, to really achieve this ambition of sustainable development, we need our local capital markets to actually develop. Domestic credit, right, beyond the banking sector, would largely, be driven by transparent and liquid local capital markets and a corporate bond market, and ultimately a capital market that can also integrate with international markets. So there's still work to be done, and we see a lot of the work that the development institutions are playing, like the Africa AFDB, in trying to drive initiatives that can help to strengthen local capital markets, and also help ultimately begin to see integration across markets. And we see that with the West African Capital Market Association. So I think, from my background, I would look at credit from a perspective of really trying to drive a market-based economy. With market-based economy, we're looking at how the capital markets can play a very critical role in enabling more access to affordable finance that is long-term and better priced, because one of the challenges most corporates have is the pricing, the perception of risk, and the tenor of financing and the currency. And this is something we've been doing in Nigeria, and there is clearly an opportunity to integrate some of these solutions across building an African capital markets that can ultimately address the big challenge of strengthening our local capacity in terms of currency savings and those domestic pools that can drive growth. Now, I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very important tool that could help significantly transform the way the continent trades within each other. For example, my flight to Mauritius is about over 12 hours from Nigeria. I had to fly through Dubai to Mauritius. You find that there are also very complex travel routes across within the continent, where countries that otherwise you ideally should have a direct flight, you probably have to even go to Europe to come back. So I think this obviously driven by part of the fragmentation that we experience in the continent. The trade will drive connectivity, trade will drive transportation, and trade will drive ultimately the efficiency we need to have a much more integrated African market. So the free trade initiative is critical, and it could potentially unlock a 3 trillion GDP economy if it's successfully implemented. So I think most governments should begin to build their national strategies around how they could build regional infrastructure ultimately, or infrastructure that is helping promote trade. And so that is one. Clearly, I've talked about the importance of building local capital markets, because we need to finance our infrastructure with domestic savings in local currency to match the income of the end users and reduce the volatility that foreign exchange brings to our countries. But this is a process, but it's a necessity that to achieve sustainable development, we need to build these resilient financial systems that can balance the traditional forms of financing that we currently use. More coordination. There are opportunities to work more coordinated across African governments and African institutions, and leverage strengths that some have that could complement others, replicate successful models that can help leapfrog and develop markets, leverage digital infrastructure, which again is something given the youthful population strength Africa has, and how the digital economy would help fast track our growth. It's a very key area of investment. And importantly, blended finance, because we can't talk about sustainable growth without taking into consideration the challenges we're having with climate change, and how Africa can achieve green growth and climate resilient development in a very innovative and strategic way. There's a huge opportunity to tap into the amount of funding that has been committed towards supporting climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and ultimately helping build more climate aligned infrastructure to help build back better, right? So I think that is something where we need to leverage a lot more of these overseas development assistance, which should not come as a grant but as investment. I think that idea of shifting from grants to investments that act as catalytic pools of funding that can be leveraged, and InfraCredit is a very good example of that. We're funded by also European governments, and our capital is being used to leverage and mobilize domestic pools of savings from the pensions to invest in infrastructure and also de-risk these projects ultimately. Now, how do we scale this up? Because if you look at this amount of grants that could be pooled to play that first loss role, it could very quickly begin to help transform, address the perception of risk issue, address the capital cost issue because it's able to come at a lower cost, address the moral hazard problems that sometimes comes with the form of grants that are deployed in, well-intended but deployed in a manner that is not driving the right type of behavior. And we're doing that working in Nigeria, for example, with the UK government. The UK government is supporting us to unlock solar mini grids in rural areas. If you look at Africa, over close to about 700 million Africans don't have, 600 million thereabout don't have energy access. We're about, I think, about three quarters of the total deficit for energy, those who don't have energy access across the world. And when you think about it, a lot of these infrastructure would be modular. We need to look at more creative ways to address the energy poverty that we struggle with in Africa, and we need to address our energy challenge to develop, right? And the idea around climate finance is heavily going to be driven by energy access. Firstly, the pension funds is obviously a safety net for the contributors, but also it's also a means of actually helping to invest long term and to help build infrastructure. To achieve that, we need to interact more and share knowledge more. We need to replicate what is working in African countries in others. We need to create these pools of long-term savings. It's very essential. We talk about foreign direct investment, which is important, but a lot more times foreign investors will come when they see local capital invested, and institutional local capital needs to be organized, and the pension fund creates one form of pooling that can play that very important role. And the challenges being faced across multiple African countries are very useful to hear. It's always about the risk reward, governance, and capital preservation issue, but beneath all of that is about innovation, because ultimately we need to find creative ways to address the poverty problem that we struggle with in Africa. We need to create more pool, more savings, and to save, people need to earn, and they need to progress to be able to have more inclusion in the savings scheme. So this platform gives you that opportunity to interact with your your colleagues and contemporaries in other markets, and help us ultimately drive this agenda. And this agenda is really, our pension funds will be that key catalyst to sustainable growth in Africa. And we need to work closely to attract more pension investments, create the frameworks, strengthen the regulatory frameworks to ensure that the fiduciary role is strengthened. But importantly is create innovative models where those capital investments can be leveraged for growth. We need to create jobs. We need to support more gender inclusion. So there is a huge opportunity to unlock blended funding and also have a green growth agenda for the continent, and leveraging the continental free trade zone. I believe this will help us promote private sector led development that is much needed. We strengthen the roles of the private sector, because we've seen how African governments are struggling under current macroeconomic challenges that are precipitated by COVID. Post-COVID recovery is now being further constrained by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and how this is impacting energy security and also food security. So we need to build the infrastructure to support our ecosystems as a continent, and limit the supply chain risks that we struggle with. So it's a process, but the instruments exist. This conference actually brings together a lot of actors across this ecosystem, and there's more need for collaboration where we leverage our collective strengths, instruments, knowledge to achieve these sustainable growth agenda that I believe is already happening, but can be strengthened in a much more impactful way.